Good evening, everybody. All right. I was told to make one announcement right off the bat, and that is the sign-in sheets will be available at the end. All right. So that means you got to be here the whole lecture, and that's not going to be a problem. My name is Stephen Edwards, and I'm the Assistant Dean for the School of Agriculture and Biological Sciences. And I'm going to start tonight with a tongue twister. To know that we know what we know, and to know that we do not know what we do not know, that is true knowledge. That's a quote. It comes from Nicholas Copernicus. He was a Renaissance era scientist. He had this very radical idea that the sun was in the center of our solar system. Copernicus, he sought out the truth throughout his entire life, and he went and he studied science. And in his day, the belief was not that the earth revolved around the sun. It was that the sun revolved around the earth. And there had been scientific thought for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. But today, we take for granted Copernicus' findings. We all agree the sun is in the center of our solar system. But it was that consistent pursuit of knowledge that Copernicus had that allowed him to make a huge scientific advancement. We also have to continually pursue scientific knowledge if we're going to continue to make advancements. Tonight, we're gathered to continue our pursuit of knowledge. So on behalf of the School of Agriculture and Biological Sciences, we'd like to welcome Dr. Walsh to campus, and we'd like to welcome you to our Martin Lecture. Dr. Lehman?
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the 32nd Annual Laurel F. Martin Lecture. As an Associate Professor of Biology and as STEM Outreach Coordinator, it has been my honor to be a part of planning this annual occurrence that was established in 1993 by Dr. Ely Glover as a tribute to his former professor, Mrs. Martin. During her 30 years of service to this institution, she served as chair of the Department of Science and Mathematics and was able to cultivate the relationships both students and colleagues that we as instructors all aspire to do ourselves. In addition to challenging her students to achieve excellence in sciences, she also nurtured and encouraged development of a personal and spiritual growth. One such student was Dr. Glover, who went on to become a professor of biology, whose career spanned 33 years. During his career, Dr. Glover fell in love with rolling farmland in south central Pennsylvania and built his home there. Earlier this week, we received the sad news that Dr. Glover has passed away, so tonight's lecture is both a tribute to him and Laurel. We would like to take a moment of silence to reflect on all that Dr. Glover contributed to our university. Both Mrs. Martin and Dr. Glover truly embodied the covenant of this institution and continue to inspire those associated with their legacies. Before we introduce our lecturer, I would like to invite Mrs. Sharon Jackson to deliver our invocation.
Good evening, everyone. As we come toward the end of the semester, there's a passage of scripture that comes to mind that I would like to read you this evening. It's 1 Corinthians 12, verses 4 through 6. Now there are varieties of gifts, but of the same Spirit. There are varieties of service, but the same Lord. And there are varieties of activities, but it is the same God who empowers them all in everyone. Let us pray. Most gracious and heavenly Father, we gather here this evening. I'd like to reflect on the many gifts that you have blessed each of us with. Each gift is as unique as the individual you have blessed. As we make our way toward the end of the semester, please help us to remember that all the gifts come from you, and let us be grateful in return. Let us recognize the gifts of others and work together to better ourselves and the world around us. Though we are blessed with different endeavors, we serve the same God. Please bless those that have gathered here tonight, as well as the speaker that has come to share with us his work in life. In this we give you all the praise, honor, and glory. In your holy name we pray. Amen.
Hello, I'm Nicholas Richardson, and I am a senior biomedical science and biochemistry major, as well as the 2024 Laurel F. Martin Science Award recipient. So our speaker for this year's Martin Lecture, Dr. Walsh, earned his PhD in biology from Bowling Green State University in 2013. He has spent over a decade at the Toledo Zoo leading the Wild Toledo initiative. Under his direction, Wild Toledo has expanded from a modest program with 3 on-ground urban initiative or prairies to over 100 prairies across Northwest Ohio and extending into Tennessee. So let's give a warm welcome to Dr. Ron Walsh.
Thank you very much. Thank you all very, very much. Let's make sure this clicker works because there were some technical difficulties. So. Perfect. All right. So as I mentioned, I'm Dr. Ryan Walsh. I work at the Toledo Zoo, which sounds kind of cool, right? The Toledo Zoo, but it's just a regular job. And at my job, there's elephants kind of thing. So anyways, I'm the director of plant conservation there, and I run Wild Toledo, which was mentioned, and we're going to talk about today. I also run the horticulture department, which we're going to talk less about. But overall, we're going to talk about Wild Toledo, kind of the experiences that I've had, because I kind of started out pretty unique. When I started at the Toledo Zoo, they were just getting Wild Toledo rolling. So it was just becoming an entity, basically. They put 3 urban prairies on Toledo Zoo property, and that was it. So I got to kind of shape the program from the very beginning, and that's kind of what we're going to talk about today. I had it too fast. So it's been almost impossible to miss in the news that pollinators are declining globally. It's an epidemic across the globe, and it has a lot of different reasons. So, I mean, even cocoa is being threatened. So there goes chocolate. Because once again, think about all the food that you eat that requires pollinators, and there really hasn't been a whole lot of attention paid to them until, let's say, 90s, early 2000s. So this thing, it's not going away. It's not going to get better. I mean, it can get better if we make changes, but if we just keep doing the same thing, maintaining status quo, it's not going to get any better. So one of the goals of the Wild Toledo program is to increase pollinator habitat, because the big things that are causing pollinators to decline is loss of habitat, use of various types of pesticides, but the loss of habitat is the #1 killer. So think of it this way. Think of these as humans instead of insects for a second. So you need a place to live, right? You need somewhere to live. You need somewhere to be able to get your food, so your grocery stores. So if we took away your house, we took away all the grocery stores, you'd have a pretty hard time living. And that's essentially what we've done with native pollinators. We've taken away their habitat, which is their house. We've taken away their food sources, which is also their house. They live in their food sources oftentimes. And then we can't figure out why they're not contributing pollinator services, all these different crops and everything else. Well, we know exactly why. We got rid of the habitat. And really, it's an entire ecosystem. I think everybody in biology knows that. So you get the insects, you attract the insects, like this wonderful monarch larvae that's down here. You attract the insects, but then that's an entire food web that's built in with that. So as a botanist, the plants are at the very bottom, right? They're the primary producers, throwing back to like, very basic biology 101. Plants are the primary producers. So that's what we do. We start out with the plants and we build the ecosystem up from there. Because once you have the plants, the insects start to show up. Once the insects start to show up, you start to get animals like this. And then before you know it, you have 70, 80 different species in a little 1/8-acre prairie. So it can be fixed. And that by doing this now, it's keeping us from having much bigger problems farther down the road. So imagine if you can't get apples or you can't get cocoa or anything else like that, because they'd all have to be hand pollinated. That's just not, it's not feasible at an agricultural scale. So really, the whole idea behind Wild Toledo is we need to do something. We need to do something now. And let's think local. Like a lot of times when you're thinking about conservation programs, you get hung up in trying to make it too big. So when you're dealing with a global problem, it's very easy to look at it as a global problem. But really, it's a bunch of tiny problems locally all put together on the globe. So if we could at least address the problems at home, in our case, Toledo, we could start working from there, kind of building upon that. And these pollinators are actually really, really cool. This is a cool little wasp. When you actually get up close and look at them, they're pretty neat. So Wild Toledo originally, I kind of mentioned prairies for a brief second. So at Wild Toledo, the original plan was let's create prairies in urban environments, which hasn't really been done very frequently. And let's use prairies because there's a bunch of advantages to them. So prairies are a native habitat to Northwest Ohio. We're actually that green blob in Ohio, right up there. So prairies would have normally been in the Midwest, basically everywhere where there are agriculture in the Midwest, that's where it used to be prairie. And we'll talk about in a second why that's also our agricultural center. So prairies are very, very basic. They're forb and grass ecosystems that lack trees or have very few trees. I think it's less than 1 tree per hectare is the definition of a prairie. Prairies, the benefit of them is you can establish a prairie in 3 to 5 years. It takes 20 years to establish a forest, and 20 is on the lower end. You can establish a prairie for about $10,000 an acre. It costs upwards of $30,000 to $40,000 an acre to do forestry restoration because it's just much more time intensive. And also, once you have a forest there, you can take it out, but it makes it less usable, basically. And that's one of the things that we ran into very early on was, well, we give you this land, but we want to be able to use it in the future if we want to. And that's a nice thing about prairies because it's just kind of a grassland ecosystem. So if they wanted to use it, they would be able to use it. So prairies also have this huge advantage, and that's the plants themselves. And notice how that's what's often considered the breadbasket of America. That's because of these plants. So prairie plants have extraordinarily deep root systems, goes all the way down to 15 to 20 feet in some species. So the root system, so what's below the soil, actually has more biomass than what's above the soil. And that gives them lots and lots of different qualities. So it allows them to colonize and break up compacted soils, which is great in an urban or suburban setting. It allows them to be incredibly winter hardy, which in Northwest Ohio is needed because the top growth might die, but you still don't have any problem with the roots that are 15 feet below the surface. And I always like to make a comparison between prairie plants and the plant that everybody would prefer where I put the prairies, but everybody's familiar with. You guys see that red arrow up there and circle? That's the depth of turf grass. So usually about 2 to 3 inches. So when your turf grass is getting brown in the summer because it's really hot and dry, prairie plants won't be getting brown because they're actually tapping into resources deep underground. And what happens is over thousands and thousands of years, those roots die, they decompose, the plants die, they decompose, and it just builds up and builds up. And that's why the Midwest is as fertile of land as it is because it used to be prairies. So in urban areas especially, there's also a problem, and it's an increasing problem with the heat island effect. And it's something that hasn't been talked about a lot in the news yet, but it's becoming a bigger and bigger problem as our summers get hotter and hotter. So this graph or pictorial kind of shows I think it's the maximum daily temperature in a city versus a suburb versus a very rural area. And essentially you have all that concrete, all that blacktop, it's just reflecting heat. So cities are incredibly hot. And really the only way economically fix that is to add plants. So not only adding prairies like I'm proposing, but adding street trees and things like that. So we've actually gotten involved with the city of Toledo because that turns out the city of Toledo, which is the Toledo metropolitan area, this is Lake Erie right here. The city of Toledo actually has some of the worst heat islands in the country. So NASA did a study, I think about 5 years ago, looking at heat islands across the entire country using satellite data. And Northwest Ohio was one of the worst places. And being from there and going there, I can tell you it's blacktop and concrete until you get outside the city. And that's something that needs to be remedied. The government in Toledo knows it needs to be remedied. And so they've actually been working with us to help add more habitat. So not only is this habitat benefiting the pollinators, benefiting a lot of native animals, but it's actually benefiting us, not just in that roundabout way of we'll have cocoa, but it's creating cooler environments for people to live. So what goes into a prairie restoration? So the first thing is we start out with properties that look exactly like this, or oftentimes much, much worse. So we're talking abandoned lots where the house was torn down. We're talking any grass areas like in Ohio along the highways, there's medians, there's grass medians, and there's strip of grass that the state has to pay to maintain every single year. So they're paying lots of money to mow that grass when we could actually just put something like a prairie in there. You don't have to mow it. It's low maintenance and it provides all those ecological benefits. And we probably have a lot less flooding on the sides of the roads as well. But anyways, so we start with this. We remove the vegetation, usually over a couple steps. So we prefer to do, or we only do our installations in the winter. And I'll get to that in a second. So we're doing this in the summer. We remove all the vegetation. And then we go out in the fall or early winter and use a seed drill, just the same kind of seed drill that ag uses, but it's been specially modified to do native plants. And we use a seed drill, we drive around, drill all the seeds in, and then wait, because all of the native prairie plants and all the plants native to up in Northwest Ohio, they require a winter dormancy in order to germinate. So if you were to put them out in the summer, they're just going to sit there. If you put them out in the fall, they might get just enough cold to germinate and then germinate in the middle of December when you have a 60-degree day or something like that. So we always put them out in the winter. They get their winter cool period, and then the follow-up kind of looks like that throughout the whole winter, just kind of an ag field. And then the next year you start seeing plants. And I know this doesn't look impressive, and honestly, for customers, this is the worst year. So we always have to get customers through this first year. Now, I'm trained in this. I can see that there's actually prairie plants coming up in here, and we go out and do surveys and do things like that. But you're growing plants from seeds, and these plants need time to get established. Those 15-foot root systems don't grow overnight. So for the first year, it kind of looks like that. By year 3, it looks like this. And you can see full of flowers, full of resources if you're a pollinator, and just much better use of the habitat compared to, whoops. Well, I'm not going to go back. Compared to just having all grass. So this is what our prairies look like. Traditional prairie, if you were to go out and if you were actually lucky enough to find a remnant prairie, most of them are gone. And look at a remnant prairie, it would have a lot more grasses. But that's one of the first things I learned when I took this job, because they don't teach you PR in biology, right? They don't teach you how to deal with interviews or public relations or anything else. So I was just kind of winging it when I first started. Some more pictures of the prairies. But one of the things that I found out very early on is people don't like tall grasses. Well, the actual type of prairie that's native to Northwest Ohio is the tall grass prairie. From what I've been told, people don't like things taller than them because they think somebody's going to hide in the grasses and jump out at them. I can assure you all that I've been working in prairies for 20 years of my career, and no one has ever hit and jumped out at me. I did have a Massasauga rattlesnake kind of come out. That was, I'd rather take a person than Massasauga, to be perfectly honest. I had turkeys jump up on me, but never anybody jumping out. So what we did though, so people don't like grasses, check, got that, figured it out. So what we did is I actually changed the percentage of forbs or flowering plants in the mix. People love flowers, right? They're not going to think people are hiding in a bed of flowers. They can't be that crazy, right? So that's what I did. So instead of a typical prairie would have about between 20 and 40% forbs, our urban prairies have between 60 and 8% forbs in the original seed mix. And it's still serving all of those ecosystem services. It's still providing habitat for all of the pollinators, native animals. And the Toledo Zoo is right smack dab almost in the middle of the city. And we have red fox living in our prairies at the Toledo Zoo. So it really is. I kind of, and this is a terrible joke, I always tell people it's like the field of dreams. If you build it, they will come. But that's really exactly how it is. It's amazing how these species who you've never seen before all of a sudden appear in the middle of an urban area. So Wild Toledo over the years became more and more successful, and we grew and grew and grew and grew. And this kind of looks like a COVID map of an outburst of a virus or something like that. But that's actually dots of all of the prairies that we put throughout Northwest Ohio. Early on, I was running the conservation program like conservation programs are typically run. So conservation is funded by a combination of grants and donations from people. And that's how 99.9% of the conservation programs in the world, probably closer, more nines than that. That's how they're funded. Grants are not the most reliable thing in the world. But so my career lesson, and I kind of jumped ahead of myself, career lesson number one is know your audience. And that's what I needed to learn first and foremost was I need to know my audience. My audience are the people who live in the city of Toledo or wherever I'm actually putting these things. obviously tonight, you all are my audience, but my audience for the prairies. And that was something that I had a hard time coming to grips with really early on, was not everybody has the same motivations, and it just seemed weird to me. So when you're in school and you're in biology, especially when you're in conservation, you're surrounded by like-minded individuals. You're surrounded by people that would be like, of course we need to restore habitat. Of course we need to conserve pollinators. And then you get out into the real world, and to put it quite frankly, you're not. You will have individuals that will be like, no, I'm not doing that. That's ridiculous. I could care less about bees, and that's going to cost X amount of dollars. So very, very early on, I had to learn that you have to know your audience, and everybody has different motivations, and that's okay. And some people's motivations are money. Some people's motivations are to do good. All different types of motivations, but you need to be able to kind of sell and convince each one of those different groups if you want to be successful in getting your point across or getting your program going. So early on, we got a Ohio EPA grant. It was an environmental education grant. And I had the idea, well, we're putting these prairies up in random locations just based on grant money or donations and things like that. Let's put them at schools so that kids can actually use them. So I teamed up with the education department. The education department created class syllabi and various class teaching methods. They actually do teaching the teachers. So they come in and provide workshops for the teachers. They come in and help the kids. And the kids that go to these schools that have prairies, which it's over 60 schools now in Northwest Ohio, that have prairies, they get to do science or take their science classes outside in a prairie, learning about those sorts of things. And if you know anything about education, one of the things you'll know is that hands-on education is always better than standing up and lecturing in front of a group of kids, especially kids this age. So that kind of spawned Project Prairie, which is our education department's program. We're basically subcontractors, Wild Toledo, and the education department goes in and works with kids. Right there, they're teaching them how to do transects. Like, how many of you knew how to do a transect at that age? That's just so cool. And that's not something you can teach in a classroom really very well, at least. And those kids are actually digging holes so that they can plant some plants. So one of the things that we do, we always start our prairies from seed. We started using plant plugs, which are just smaller plugs, just to kind of head start the prairies, because you saw the year one pictures, right? There's no flowers, and people are like, I thought this was going to be all flowers, even though we always show them those year one pictures. So we use plant plugs. So we had the idea, okay, we're going in with a bunch of kids. We want these kids to actually have some buy-in into the prairie. We wanted it to be their prairie, not the school's prairie, not the teacher's prairie. So what's one of the best ways you can get kids involved? Get them dirty. So the very first thing that they do when they come back, when they have a new prairie, they come back and they plant plugs for us. So free labor for us. And these kids absolutely have a ball over it. And they're learning, they're getting in the dirt, they're doing sort of things that they should be doing. And it's just a much better educational outcome. And I'm not talking about education tonight, but I know they've been measuring our education outcomes, and state test scores have actually gone up in the classes that have prairies and utilize the prairies. So that's kind of cool, and that makes me feel a little bit better about my job some days. So career lesson number 2 is there will always be detractors. And holy moly, everything I've described up to this point seems pretty like non-controversial, right? Like it just seems, it makes sense. But holy moly, were there detractors. And that's not something that I was really ready for. So my first year, I'm going to show news articles from this year, but my first year at the Toledo Zoo, one of their original prairies was along the Anthony Wayne Trail median, and the zoo is spread out across the trail. We're split in two by the Anthony Wayne Trail. And the median, we had put a prairie. It had been there for, I think, like 4 years at that point. So it was established. And this is my first year as a biologist working for the Toledo Zoo. And they mow it. Now, mowing a prairie we actually use mowing as a management technique sometimes. Prairie plants, remember those big, deep root systems that I showed? If you mow the plant, they're actually adapted to herbivory. So it's just like simulating herbivory. But if you mow it and scalp it, and you have to mow it right, basically. Well, the city of Toledo did not do that. And then all of a sudden, the prairies that we made were becoming the hot issue in the town. So the Toledo Blade, which is the Toledo newspaper, had a full page ad where every single mayoral candidate stood in the median and said whether they were pro prairie or against prairie. I had to do all sorts of interviews about it. And that's one of those things I'm like, I had no idea there were people that would be against prairies and against saving the city some taxpayers' dollars. And it doesn't go away. So this is what happened this year. They decided finally that they were going to get rid of the prairie. And this is government spending for you. They wanted to get rid of the prairie, put a formal garden on the Anthony Wayne Trail using native plants that cost $300,000. Now, mind you, this prairie cost them nothing and saved them a bunch over 10 years. Cost $300,000 and would have $100,000 a year maintenance versus the prairie that had zero maintenance. So it just made no sense. It kind of got on my nerves, and it got on the CEO of the Toledo Zoo's nerves as well. So we launched a PR attack at the city of Toledo, and this is kind of what came out of it. So again, they don't teach you how to do PR in grad school at all. So I've always just winged it. So unfortunately, when you talk to reporters, you have to be very careful what you say because they'll run with it. So I said something about this is going backwards, not forwards, about getting rid of the prairie and putting a formal landscape in there. It seemed absolutely backwards. And then the next morning I woke up and I have Google alerts that every single time I'm mentioned in the news, which happens all the time now, every time I'm mentioned in the news, it gives me a Google alert. And holy moly, I had Google alerts from Anchorage, Alaska, Hawaii, all across the country. Apparently this news story got picked up by the AP and is ran at local news stations all across the country, which was horrifying, but also made the mayor look bad. So it was a win for me, right? And that's what the prairie used to look like. So you can see how the Toledo Zoo split. It's on both sides of the St. Anthony Wayne Trail. The prairie was, I think it was a total of 5 acres up and down the middle. Matter of fact, Dr. Lehman, I think, probably went out on that prairie when she worked for me. Very, very long time ago. So it was a great prairie, provided habitat. We actually did invertebrate sampling out on the prairie to see, because one thing people would say is, well, the bugs are just going to get hit by cars as they're driving. Well, they can also fly up. They don't just fly over. So they flew up and over, and you can do mortality counts based on, looking at what's dead along the side of the road to see, count road mortality. And there really wasn't an increased road mortality when we put a prairie there versus a non-prairie. There were a breeding monarch colony that was out on the middle of the prairie. Now, it looks like this. And I love that picture because the city of Toledo put that sign up and then they never took it down when they got rid of the wildflower area. So it's just irony. I'm not trashing the city of Toledo, but they made some very questionable choices. I think that's government in general, though, so we won't go on that tangent. So career lesson number 3, grants are not sustainable no matter how good you think you are. And that's something that I learned next. So I'm kind of walking you through my career as it develops. So this is, I'm trying to think of a nice way to put it, the grant cycle. We'll just call it the grant cycle. You know, some people might say it's, you know, the 10th circle of hell, but it's the grant cycle. And you get stuck in the cycle like all cycles are. So you get really excited about a program, you write up a great grant proposal with all the nitpicky details that they want, whatever, in each granting agency. And even if you're dealing with federal dollars, each federal agency has different rules. Each grant has different rules. It's a fun time. I can't describe how excellent it is. So you write that up and you have your hopes and dreams up, and then you get back and either you got funded, in which case you do your grant, good deal, you keep going, or you didn't get funded, and how are you going to fund your program then that year? And there's funding is not guaranteed, and it's especially not guaranteed today. So I wanted a different way. I didn't want my program, or I didn't want to hire people and then have to lay them off because the grant was done and we didn't get another grant. It's just not sustainable for a conservation program to run that way. So think of it, you know, I'm talking about native plants and native pollinators, but think about African elephants. So should we only conserve African elephants if there's an active grant going on, or should we conserve them all the time? I think the answer is pretty obvious to that, but that's just kind of how the world of academia and grants works. So that's how it goes. And you get stuck in that cycle and there's no way out. And I wanted Wild Toledo to be a bit different. And as a graduate student, I don't know, I think most of you are undergrads, so I don't know if you know PhD comics, but this pretty much sums up life writing grants is, you know, just pounding your head on the table. And that's what I didn't want to do. So Bill Gates once said, I'll take the laziest person over the most motivated person, because you take the lazy person and assign a task, they're going to find the most efficient way to do it possible. So I was looking for the much more efficient, lazy way to do this Wild Toledo thing than writing these grants all the time. And grants, again, you know, I know I already said that as a career lesson, but grants are not sustainable. And I'm sure you've all seen the news. If you've not, grants, federal grants are pretty much frozen across the board. U.S. Fish and Wildlife, one of the organizations where I primarily got grants from, all of their funding is frozen. So this was 10 years ago when I was making these decisions, but it really paid off because I still have a job now, and who knows if I would have had a job if we were completely grant reliant. So it's kind of weird that that's how these programs run, is getting grants and asking for handouts. And that just leaves a bad taste in my mouth. It's not something that I like to do. I would rather be able to earn the money. So how do we go about doing that with my Wild Toledo program? So what I did was create a business. So we're still a nonprofit. Wild Toledo is actually a separate entity now, but at the very beginning it wasn't. So we're still a nonprofit. So the profits go back, are reinvested into the business, which in the case of this business, it's a conservation business. So the profits are just reinvested right back into conservation. So we have 3 parts of our program, and it's a business at this point. We charge for the prairie installations now, which originally we were doing it for free because they were grant funded. We started charging for prairie installations, and somehow that actually increased the demand. giving things away for free. Apparently people don't like that. I have no idea. But we were like desperate when we had grants trying to find locations to put prairies. All of a sudden we start charging for them and everybody wants them. Weird. Humans are weird. That's why I study plants. So, I heard some agreement there. So, so my background is really weird as well. So my background is in plants. I've been a plant nerd from a very small child. So I was having lunch with some of the students earlier and I told them, so the best way to describe this was in 6th grade, I was the team captain of the football team, and I had my own personal rose garden that I had built in 6th grade. So I was a weird kid, to say the least. But all that knowledge that I got just being a kid and just learning it like a sponge and taking up all that information about plants, turns out it's actually helpful later in life. So I had absolutely no problem starting up a state licensed nursery. So that was something else that we had customers, they're now customers, but we had people originally coming to us and saying, I'd love to put some native plants in my yard. I don't have a big enough yard to do a whole prairie. Usually a prairie is like above an acre. We do them at about an 1/8 acre for the schools, just because schools don't always have that much space. But understandably, not everybody can do that. So where can we buy native plants? And in Northwest Ohio, back then especially, there was really nowhere to buy native plants. You couldn't get them. You'd have to mail order them, drive several hours up into Michigan to get them. It just wasn't available. So we just kind of went with the demand. There's clearly a demand for native plants. So we met that demand just like a business would, and we made that part of our business. And then several years went by and the nursery took off. And actually, I started the nursery in 2020, which is unfortunate to say the least, but it actually was one of the best things that could have ever happened. So the nursery opened in 2020 and everything was locked down in the state of Ohio during the pandemic, except for plant nurseries. We're one of the exceptions. So what we did is we created a website, we offered delivery services, we offered no contact pickup, and there's this awesome website that you can buy native plants from your pajamas at home and then drive by the zoo, pick them up, and you're on your way, you're good to go. So that was extremely popular, and that just led the nursery business to grow in leaps and bounds. And then we were getting people saying, you know, I bought a lot of plants from you. They're very healthy plants, but I got to call, I'm a brown thumb kind of thing. I got to admit, I'm a brown thumb. So we had people saying that to us, asking if we provided landscaping services. Now we're getting really far afield from anything that conservation is usually doing. But if you think about it, we're still using native plants, right? So we're still putting native plants out into the community, increasing habitat. We're just doing it in a different way. We're not doing it in a park. We're doing it all across Northwest Ohio. We're not limited to parks like park districts are. And that's kind of cool because park districts aren't going to be looking at areas where there's houses to do conservation work. Whereas that's the ideal place for us. We want areas that are houses because those are the areas that need the most attention. So long story short, we started a landscaping business on top of it. So Wild Toledo is now those 3 businesses put together. So we prairie installation, we run a state licensed nursery, and we do landscape installations, and we're vertically integrated because most landscape companies, they buy from a nursery. So when they put in a landscape for you, they charge you what the nursery charged them plus a fee on top of it. So what that allows us to do, since we're actually growing all of our plants from seeds and cuttings, we can undercut the competition, because they can't match our price because there's like 3 or 4 middlemen in between them getting their plants and getting them to the customer. Whereas with us, there's no middleman. You get the plants directly from the nursery. So that's worked out incredibly well, so much to the point I now have 4 full-time staff work for me, and 3 of them are actually, one in each of these programs runs each one of those programs. And then the 4th one is a general manager. And they don't have to worry about their jobs disappearing. They don't have to worry about, grants running out or anything else like that because the business is going crazy. We're quickly approaching $1 million in revenue, which is crazy. And that's not something that I could have gotten if I had written grants, maybe a good NSF grant is what, $300,000, something like that. So, and I am going to be the first to admit, I'm probably not going to get a $300,000 NSF grant anytime soon. So the only way that we could be doing what we're doing is by running a business instead of doing it kind of the old fashioned way. And these are just some pictures of our nursery. And we even went further than that. So I'm really big into sustainability. So what I call this is sustainable conservation. So it's conservation that's sustainable in that it's not dependent upon any granting agency. It's not dependent upon whims of the administration, the administration you work for, the administration of the city. It's not dependent on any of that. It's just dependent on running a good business. So using capitalism to do conservation seems like a great idea to me. And then we try to be sustainable in all methods. So the nursery industry uses a ton of water, as you can imagine. Hopefully you all have house plants or have dealt with plants at one point in time. Plants need water. So nurseries often have, huge water costs that are associated with them. So one of the things we did was actually use a type of mat. It's called a capillary mat. And it's something it started being used in the 1800s. And it's very basic. It's a wool layer sandwiched in between a solid plastic layer and then a landscaping fabric layer. And what the capillary mat allows us to do is we put water into the capillary mat automatically. And then the plants change the mixture of various components in the soil for each different type of plant. And then plants sit on the capillary mat and the plants suck up the water, which is awesome. Everything's automated. So I don't have to teach people how to water. I don't have to teach people, don't kill this plant or you got to look out for these things. That's not even a concern anymore. And now we're growing 15, 20,000 plants a year. So it's just not practical to have, they would need to hand water all day, every day. There would need to be a job for that. So the capillary matting actually reduces our water usage by 70% compared to overhead watering, which is the traditional way of doing it. So we're always on the lookout for ways to conserve resources within the nursery itself. And this is actually something that's starting to take off. Walmart actually started using capillary mats so that they didn't kill their plants in 3 days like they usually do. So this is kind of cool. This is a time lapse, and this is actually only about a month of growth in the Wild Toledo greenhouse. And it just absolutely takes off. It's kind of cool. That's what it looks like right now. This was from a couple of years ago, but it looks very similar. The plants are in the same stage. So that was I didn't put that up there, but that was another lesson that I kind of learned. So we were selling native plants when everybody else sold native plants. So there were some nonprofits that would sell native plants around Mother's Day, and that was about it. And we would sell little plants that, we started. We didn't have heated greenhouse at the time, and it wasn't working out very well. So I'm like, why don't we head start these things Mother's Day is the biggest plant day of the year. That's when everybody shops. So why don't we start them in January when it's still very frigid, or February when it's very frigid in Northwest Ohio. And by the time May comes along, we're going to have full, huge, big flowering plants. And that is that's one of the reasons why we've grown so quick. They choose us over, now there is competition, but the competition doesn't head start their plants. So we were just listening to customers, listen to the customers, and now we're a better company for it. This is the website that I was talking about. And the idea is make it as easy as possible for people to get into this. So you want as many people as possible to get into your conservation program, right? Or to be aware of it. And this is the same thing, but we want as many people as possible to start gardening, start using native plants in their yard. So we have this website where you can select the color of plants that you like, the height that you want, whether you have sun or shade, wet or dry, and it will narrow down the over 500 plants we carry in the Wild Toledo Nursery down to whatever, and then have recommendations for you. So that's a super important thing that often gets overlooked, because a lot of times people are just like, I am completely overwhelmed. I don't know where to start. And this very, very simple website, it's a Shopify website, really helps a lot of customers. And we've gotten a lot of people start using native plants just because of the website. So you never know, it might just be very, very advantageous. And then the landscaping, of course, we do landscaping all over the area. We do it for Fortune 500 companies all the way up to, small landscape beds at people's houses. And that's been, a huge success, and it's been a huge success both financially, but more importantly, it's been a success by getting all those plants out into the environment. So we tried to come up with how many plants we've planted. Obviously, we use seeds in the prairie installations, but we're well over 1 million plants now that we've gotten out in Northwest Ohio. And we would have never been able to do that had we not changed up the way we did things and done things differently. So the first 10 years were what I just described to you, and the next 10 years or the next 11 years is going to be a whole new chapter. So currently we're working with my alma mater, Bowling Green State University. They leased us a 14-acre property, and the business has grown so much, or the program has grown so much, that we're selling out every single year. And if you're selling out of plants, that means that your demand is probably more than that. So we wound up doing a huge expansion down in Bowling Green. It's about 20 miles south, and we have a commercial facility there where we just opened up 2 new greenhouses that are going to increase our capacity by over 6 times. So we should be able to, at max, grow upwards of 100 to 120,000 native plants in a year, and use that to get out into the community, sell people, and use in native landscapes. And it's really cool, and who would have known I would have been doing this? I had no idea. Here's some pictures of the greenhouse. I actually built these greenhouses. I literally built them, my employees and I. They're all licensed and they're all, inspected and everything. So I promise it's all good. But we've been building these all winter. So putting up plastic on a greenhouse in the middle of winter was not the most rewarding experience I've had in the field, but the greenhouses are coming together. Those lights up top, those are actually how we head start them. Because if you try to start plants in February that don't normally start in February, they don't like that light cycle and they'll actually die. So they're not getting enough light. So we figured out if you give them supplemental light, so it's like a 12-hour on, 12-hour off, instead of, I think in Northwest Ohio, we have 7 hours of daylight if we're lucky in the middle of winter. We use grow lights in order to do that, and that allows us to head start the plants and get plants even bigger. And I'm very happy to say that one of our critics, professor at a local university, we won't name his name, but he likes to go on Facebook rants about me, or about Wild Toledo. He labeled our plants as too big and gaudy because our plants were so large. I'm like, okay, but that's what works. So really, he was just, upset because his nursery couldn't produce as many plants or things like that, whatever. But once again, you're going to have detractors. That's just something you have to get used to. And it's something I've had to deal with from the very beginning. So, career lesson for doing things differently can be incredibly unpopular. And colleagues just don't like change. And I'm not necessarily talking about colleagues, which this does apply to colleagues that you're working with. But I'm also talking about, so I have colleagues that work for the Metro Parks, and I have colleagues that work for various organizations. And this idea of using a business to fund conservation and kind of, instead of being in that grant loop, kind of be in a business loop. This idea was taken very poorly by a lot of conservation people in Northwest Ohio. There's lots and lots of different reasons why, but people don't like change and people don't like doing things differently. So I would highly encourage you to do things differently if it makes sense, but be prepared that oftentimes people will fight against you. And that was something that I learned, and it was a shock, really. Because you think, okay, your colleagues, you're all in it for the same purpose. You're all trying to conserve species. Does it really matter how you get to that end goal as long as we're getting to that end goal? Well, apparently it does. And if you don't get to the end goal the way they want it to get to, they're not huge fans. So you'll have to learn to deal with it, but you let it roll off your back and you keep going, and your success then proves them wrong. So between the mayor of the city of Toledo not really being a huge fan of us now, and then some of our colleagues being against using capitalism to fund conservation, I think the Douglas Adams quote all the time. I actually considered hanging them in my office. So Douglas Adams wrote Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. He was kind of a humorous British writer. In the beginning, the universe was created. This has made a whole lot of people very angry and has been widely regarded as a bad move, except I changed that a little bit and make it more appropriate for me. And that's how it feels some days, is that we shouldn't have done this, but it keeps working. So we just got to keep doing it. Career lesson 5 then is school. And this is something that I think they tell you guys now. They did not tell us back when we were in school. I can promise you that. So what you're learning today is only like a very, very small part of your education. Your education is going to continue for the rest of your life. Hopefully you don't just wind up being one of those people that I click this mouse when this buzzer goes off, and that's what I do as a career. Nothing wrong with that. If you want to do that, have at it. But if you want to grow, learning is the number one way to grow. So my career at this point, so I've gone from being a regular field biologist to the director of plant conservation at the Toledo Zoo. I run the horticulture department as well, which we're not going to really talk about a whole lot about. But I run lots of programs. I'm at the upper echelon of the organization, and I've been fairly successful in what I did. And about 5% of this was learned in school. So school, like I said, did not teach me how to talk to the news, which I don't know if there's any way to prepare to talk to the news, but like running a nursery or growing plants or pretty much any of the skill sets that I needed to start this, I learned those on my own. And that's really important. And I've seen that in my employees as well. The employees that can go, I see a problem in front of me. I don't know how to solve it. I've talked to everybody around me. They don't know how to solve it. So I'm going to do some research and figure it out. And those are the employees that always succeed because they're learning something new every single day. So that's kind of a mantra of mine. I try to do it. I try to learn something new every day, try to do something, try something different with plants. And that's just how we grow as people. And that's how you grow an organization as well. But I can't stress enough to the student out there, your academic qualifications are fantastic and you need them, but you also need non-academic qualifications. So if you're trying to get a job in the field of biology, so when I hire seasonals and part-time biologists for Wild Toledo, I get about 180 applicants for each position. There's no way I'm reading through 180 applicants. So we have to go through a screening process. And that's why I say you have to do other things. Set yourself apart, get through those screening process, because otherwise you're just going to be another number. If you just got a degree and that's all you've really done, you're just going to be another person who has a degree, doesn't set you aside from anything. So do volunteer work. Do work in your field, even if you're not getting paid for it. Just do something, work in some of the labs. Volunteer to work for a lab. Do an independent study project. All of those things add up. And those are things that you can put on your resume, and that's what allows. And those are all things that you're learning from as well. You're growing as a person and learning, not just having fun at these various things. So yeah, Wild Toledo is just a huge program at this point. It's got those 3 parts. And we've been trying to grow faster than I think we should be growing. We've been growing about 130% year over year, which is a little extensive. But one of the other cool things that I've found from this is that I'm able to hire other biologists. And I'm able to kind of like tutor other biologists as they come up. Sarah, Dr. Lehman actually worked for me as one of my part-time employees, and that was awesome. She was an absolutely fantastic employee. I would take her back any day. Probably can't pay her enough now, though. So anyways, Wild Toledo's expanded substantially. I've been successful, supposedly. Things have gone really well, but that is my final career lesson. Embrace new experiences. So you're going to have a lot of self-doubt. In anything you do, you're going to doubt that unless you're like one of those unique people who just thinks that they're awesome and they can do everything perfect. I am not one of those people. So you're always going to experience self-doubt, and that self-doubt, just kind of convince yourself that that's what's actually holding you back. So there is a term that I didn't know until I got into graduate school, and then I became intimately familiar with this term, and it's imposter syndrome. Has anybody heard of imposter syndrome? Yeah. Well, yeah, of course, everybody who's gone to grad school is like, yes, I know exactly what it is. So basically, you think you're an imposter. You're like, I don't know what I'm doing. How did I get in this position? I don't deserve this. How would I possibly do what I'm being asked to do? And let me tell you a little secret. That never really goes away. You just learn to make that little voice in your head a little quieter. So I feel like an imposter every single day at work. I feel like an imposter standing up here on this stage, talking about these programs that I built over the last decade. Obviously, I'm not an imposter, but I still feel like it. So that's something that you have to learn to overcome. And I think it's part of being human. and it's definitely part of growing your career, whether you're going into science, going into academia, or going into something completely different. You're always going to feel like you're in over your head. And if you let yourself sink, that's going to be it. But if you just keep treading water and keep swimming, cool things can happen. So embrace new experiences, even if you don't think you could do it. And I have a bunch of examples of that, because one of the perks of working at the zoo is you get to do some weird stuff. Like, my job gets really weird sometimes. Sarah, as a part-time employee of mine, kept trying to pet the dingoes. So I spent a large amount of time convincing her that no, you cannot pet the dingoes in the yard. They will bite you. They are cute. Anyways, so I've done some weird things, and we're going to talk about a few of them here in a second. As soon as that slide pops up. There we go. So the first one, why do I have mosque picture up here? It's totally applicable, I promise. So I think I was about 3 years into my stint at Wild Toledo. Hadn't been there that long. Thankfully, I had a passport, and the CEO comes up. At that point, I was sharing an office with the boss, and my boss only has a master's. I have a PhD. I like to rib him on that all the time, because he puts MS behind his name, and I put PhD in bigger letters just to have fun with him, but whatever. So anyways, so the CEO comes in and he's like, which one of you wants to go to the United Arab Emirates? And he's like, not me, I'm out. So everybody's looking at me, and I'm like, well, sure, what am I going for? Well, the World Association of Zoos and Aquariums was putting on their annual conference at the United Arab Emirates. I had no idea what the United Arab Emirates, I knew it was a country, and that's about it. That's all I knew about it. I did some research real quick, and keep in mind, this is like 2015, 2016. So things are kind of hot. Not that things aren't always kind of hot in that region, but things were really hot in that region at that time. So I had some misgivings, but I was like, you know what? When is the chance I'm ever going to be able to go to the United Arab Emirates again? Seize that opportunity, right? And so I did. And I got some of the coolest experiences I've ever had. I got to visit these wonderful landmarks, historical landmarks. I got to go to all these galas, because as it turns out, the king actually owns the zoo. So, and he's a big conservationist. So the king was putting on this annual conference, which I had no idea showing up. Thank God I packed a suit, because I would have been the only person there without a suit. And I don't think you're going to get a men's suit that fits me in the middle of the United Arab Emirates. Definitely not. And there's a picture of me with a camel just to prove I was in the United Arab Emirates. Doesn't really prove anything. I'm at a zoo, but we don't have any camels. But this is one of those crazy experiences. I was actually talking to the kids at lunch about that. So I went to one of the galas one night, and they were like, oh, you have to go check out the gardens here at I can't remember what it was. It was named after the king. And because the king was being on this conference, his children were there, and he's got like a gazillion children. I can't even tell you how many. But they're princes and princesses. So that was the first time I ever had a prince and a princess before, like shook their hands. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what I was supposed to do, but I was like, all right, cool. So this woman walks up to me, and she was like, I heard you're a botanist. Yep. And very, very clear English. Like, she was clearly originally from the Middle East, but very clear English. She was like, well, I would really like to walk the gardens with you and talk about the plants, because this is a zoo. I'm not interested in animals. I'm interested in plants. They're kind of my thing. So nobody else here wants to walk around the garden. So I walked around the gardens with this woman, and we were talking. And she starts talking about the royal family and things like that. And I'm like, that's kind of weird, but different cultures, different strokes. And then it comes out she's a princess. And I'm like, wait, I'm walking through a private tour of a garden with a princess. How the heck did that happen? But that's just one of those unusual, I wouldn't give that experience for the world. It's because how often do you get to say that you did something like that? But the only reason that was able to be done, or I was able to do those cool things, was because I said yes. I didn't think I could do it. I was almost positive I was going to get kidnapped or something while I was there. But it all went well. I had cool experiences. And that's just kind of a lesson for everyone. Just, embrace it. This was my next challenge at the Toledo Zoo, and this was a doozy. So the Toledo Zoo was a lot of the buildings. So the building in the background, it was built during the Works Progress administration. Hopefully some of you have taken history and know about that. But during the Great Depression, there was a federally funded program called the WPA, Works Progress Administration. And they built all the buildings. It was basically to get people working during the Great Depression when there were no jobs or anything else. So they built this building, and we try to conserve them because they are cool historical buildings. So we decided to redo the Museum of Science. Cool. CEO comes in one day and he's like, I want a massive greenhouse out front of it. Okay. So I'm thinking, like, what's a massive greenhouse? It's going to be 63 foot tall. It's going to be, I think it's like 2,500 square foot on the inside. Extremely large greenhouse. Seems like, I want you to plant it up with plants. And I'm like, I have no idea how to do. I didn't tell them this. You never tell somebody you don't know how to do it. You're just like, okay, that sounds good. But I jumped into it, and the Museum Tropics came about from it. So this is what it looks like today. It's pretty cool. It's pretty lush. I learned how to import plants into the country. I learned how to order big plants from Florida and Hawaii and all sorts of locations. And notice there's glass missing there. That's for a reason. So the next problem was the CEO's like, but I want big plants. I don't want, like little tiny plants. I want it to look like it's been here forever. Okay, cool. So where do I get full-size trees from? No idea. Went through, got a plant broker. So that's a job, by the way. You just broker exchanges. And we wound up getting a 25-foot tall banyan tree, which is the ficus. It's native to India. They can get huge. Like, they can cover a whole city block, basically. And they drop down these really cool aerial roots. They're very neat looking trees. So I bought a 25-foot one. But the next question was, how do you plant a 25-foot tree? It turns out you use a crane to move it into the building, into the greenhouse. And then the pot is about from the podium to that fern. And cut the pot off, and hopefully you dug a hole ahead of time and you drop it in, and that's how you do it. But again, we just figured it out on the go. But now it's this awesome exhibit that Toledoans have been enjoying for going on 7 years now, I think. And would have never assumed I would have done something like this before. And I would have never thought I'd be able to do something like this before. But again, just take the leap. And then in 2021, Wild Toledo had done so well that I was asked to take over the horticulture department. And our horticulture department was very, very old-fashioned when I took it over. When I mean old-fashioned, I mean all of their paperwork and files are actual paperwork and files. So there was nothing digitized. The budgets were handwritten. So I took over the horticulture department, even though my background's not in horticulture. But the number one issue that I ran into, that I was concerned about rather, was every year we throw a big Lights Before Christmas display. And it's this huge annual display. We have over 1 million lights. And guess who runs Lights Before Christmas? The horticulture department. So now I'm in charge of a light show. Now, I know you guys don't really know me. I'm not really a big fan of Christmas decorations, and I, like many people, cringe when the Christmas music. I mean, it's about time they start playing Christmas music now. I mean, I'm surprised they ever stop anymore. See? So I'm really not that huge into Christmas, but I kind of just jumped into it, and this is what it looked like last year. It turned out pretty nice. We use a whole bunch of modern technology, gasp. All the lights are programmable, so you can change the colors. So if somebody comes in one night, it looks different than the other night, things like that. So it turned out really well. And the same with running the horticulture department. There are challenges. I'm having some challenges right now, but when I took over the horticulture department, one of the things I did was institute policy that in areas that didn't have a theme, we were going to plant native plants on grounds. And what we've been able to do over the last 4 years is actually save an entire position worth of time by using native plants instead of the ornamental plants that they were using. So instead of planting annuals everywhere, you plant native perennial plants. They come back every year. Zoo's putting its money where its mouth is and using these native plants that we're selling. So, and then it's a great way to be able to educate to the public, because I slap a sign in there, advertise Wild Toledo, talk about how it's a cool thing to do, and it's a win-win situation. That hasn't always been popular, but people like it. People are coming around to it, I should say. And then in some areas, we do not use, or we use ornamental plants, which is perfectly fine. And that's one of the things that I run into all the time in my field is people are almost like perfectionists. So it's either their way or the highway, like I said earlier. So a great example of this, has anyone heard of local genetics? Yeah? Okay. So the gist of it is that if you're storing a plant habitat, you should use plants from that area. Except they take it one step further and say that you should use the same genetic material from that area. So, and then our local groups have taken it one step further. And when we're talking areas, Fish and Wildlife, considers like half of the Great Lakes area. So that kind of makes sense, right? In our area, they think that all of the seeds should only come from the Oak Openings, which is this little tiny area in Northwest Ohio that actually has unique habitat, and that we shouldn't be planting prairies because we're using seed from Wisconsin and not from that habitat. Now, we've planted over 200 acres of prairies, which is actually more than Metroparks has done in that equivalent period of time. Why is that how it works? Because the Metroparks doesn't have enough seed to plant that much prairie. So they criticize our program because we're using non-local genetics, but it really, at this point in time, does it really matter? We have everything out there. We have all sorts of invasive species, and really conservation is a science of emergency. We're constantly in an emergency mode trying to fix something. And would you rather have something good out there or nothing good whatsoever? And unfortunately, some of my colleagues think nothing good because you're not putting the right plants out there. And that's kind of the way that people get stuck in their dogma. And that's something that you got to try to avoid as in yourself as your career progresses, is not getting stuck in that dogma, because what does that do? So they're the same. They also don't think that you should be using ornamental plants in the landscape or anything like that. And what does that do when you're trying to get people into your, to work with you instead of fight against you? So when you tell people you can only do it this one way and you have to sacrifice all these things in order to do it this one way, they're not going to do it. You might have a handful of people that'll do it, but for the vast majority, they're going to like, no, I like my life how it is. I'm not going to change, and I'm just not going to do it. And that's kind of where my disagreement is with some of the other people in my field, is that I think you can have a best of both worlds. Like, they talk about restoring the habitat to pre-European settlement is what the Metro Parks classifies as their goal for their restorations. Now think about that for a second. European settlement in Northwest Ohio would have been, I know you guys are like way, way long time ago, but we're talking like the 1800s. But the world has changed an awful lot since the 1800s. The world's not the same. The climate's not the same. The environment's not the same. There's several million people more in that area than there used to be. You can't go back in time. You can't go back to the 1800s, and constantly striving for that is just setting yourself up for failure. And instead of turning people off onto your program or turning people off, get people into it and say, yeah, you can just put a single milkweed in your yard and you might be able to attract butterflies. And that's a selling point for people. And we've had so many customers that have come into Wild Toledo and they're just so thrilled because we're like, no, you can make a difference. You can do a change. Just by adding a couple plants into your yard, you'd be shocked at the amount of native organisms that it brings in. And that's really, I think, the key to Wild Toledo is it's being inclusive and being understanding that everybody has different preferences. And everybody is not going to agree with you. It's okay. The reasons why we do prairie restorations for places are all across the map. So we don't just do prairie restorations or landscape installs or anything else for people who want to conserve the environment. A whole bunch of our customers, they just want to save money on maintenance. So that's great. That's fine. You're helping the environment. You're saving money on maintenance. It's a win-win for both of us. That's the kind of situation that you want. Whereas if you tell people, nope, you got to get rid of everything in your yard, you're done, and you got to use all these new plants, they're never going to do it. And that's kind of what has allowed Wild Toledo to be successful, while two other places tried to do what we did before that and just kind of failed. The next one, and one of the final ones that I'm going to talk about, is the orchid show. So I did my dissertation work on orchids, like ecology of the orchids. I was doing field research. I wasn't doing this. This is a whole different level. So the CEO comes in one day and he's like, "You like orchids, right?" Yeah. I did my dissertation on them. I think we should do an orchid show. A what? We should do an orchid show. Okay. I have no idea how to put on an orchid show, but I went ahead and did it. We now bring in over 2,000 orchids every year. We create our own props, like a prop department. Like that wall was created. The rock wall was created from my number two, basically. He's fantastic. He does all sorts of things. And the whole reason he was able to make something that looks like that is because he does that at home. He's really big into keeping terrariums at home. So another thing that you learn from hobbies. Hobbies are super important for your jobs. I can't even stress how important they are. If I hadn't had this hobby, I wouldn't have the job that I had today. But this was another example of I was way over my head. It was absolutely frightening, to say the least. I was trying to think of a better word than frightening. I really didn't think I was going to be able to do that. And the Toledo Zoo is like a big thing in Toledo. Like, we have more per capita people who have memberships than any other zoo in the country. So it's like a really big deal in Toledo. So when you're putting a show on, you're going to get a lot of people to come to it, and you're going to have a lot of criticism if you didn't do a good job. So anyways, this year was our 6th annual orchid show. It's kind of just grown leaps and bounds. It's absolutely crazy. And I kind of approach this orchid show the exact same way I approach everything, it seems like. And Wild Toledo was, okay, so they want to bring in X number of orchids. Last year it was 2,200 orchids that we brought, semi-trucks full of orchids coming up from Florida in the middle of February. Talk about a nightmare, because it's really cold in Toledo in February. Orchids don't like cold. At least these orchids don't. So we put on this orchid show. It keeps getting bigger and bigger. But how do we make money off of it? Or how do we make sure, how do we make sure this continues, right? So I don't just want to do a one and done program. I want to be able to make sure this continues every single year. And if you're, this is more like a zoo type world thing. So maybe if you played Zoo Tycoon, you might understand. But the first year, whenever you put on an event, oftentimes the turnout's not huge. It takes a couple years for people to like realize an event's actually occurring and things like that. So it took us several years. The first year we had, I think, 12,000 people, which was a huge deal. It was awesome. And that helps pay for it, helps defray the costs, but it still costs a lot of money. So what I decided to do early on in the orchid show, instead of literally chucking those orchids when you're done, because that's what a lot of shows do, they just throw them out in the dumpster. Let's sell all the orchids to all the people who are ogling all the orchids during the show. We'll sell them really cheap. We'll get them out, and then we'll be able to defray the costs of the orchid show. And that was incredibly successful. And we're able to move 2,000 orchids in a matter of less than 3 hours. Get them all out the door, recoup some of the costs for the Toledo Zoo. And of course, I get to teach conservation using signage throughout the orchid show. So there's signs throughout all the orchid show talking about orchidaceae and the cool things about orchids. And so my goal, usually when I'm putting in something at the zoo, is to teach somebody something. And if somebody can get something out of it, that's absolutely fantastic. So in summary, people are always going to say that you can't do it. And you're going to always say that you can't do it. The people saying that you can't do it are usually best ignored. So if I listened to people very early on, I wouldn't have been in this point in my career. I don't even know if I would have been in biology. So you have to learn just to be able to say no. And obviously these all have caveats. Like people say you can't fly, by flapping your arms. I'm not telling you to go out and try flying by flapping your arms. But if it's something that you're passionate about and that you think will succeed, take a shot, because even if you fail, you're still going to learn something. And think long-term and practice sustainability in all aspects. And that's something that was kind of unique with Wild Toledo, is most people don't think about setting up a program sustainably. And that's why they wind up in those terrible grant cycles, right? So if you think about sustainability more, not just as an environmental thing, but, keeping your budget every month is sustainable, is building sustainability. Think of it that way, and you create much more robust systems when you do it that way. And doing things differently will often be unpopular. But if it makes sense, do it anyways. So when you all venture out into your careers in the real world, you're going to find that there are definitely people who say, well, this is the way we've done it for the past 20 years. Why should we change how we're doing it? And a lot of times they've been doing it that way for the past 20 years. Sometimes that's right. That's why they've been doing it. Or A lot of times that's completely the wrong way, and you can think of an easier way, a better way that they can do it, but you have to convince those people to do it. And they're not always going to go along with it, and they're going to grumble, and it's just kind of a part of life. And education is lifelong. If you want to be successful, learning doesn't stop at a diploma, and I can't stress that enough. I still, every single day, I have experiments running in my house, like just for fun, not like real experiments. So, I mean, about as real, they're actually much more real than most people. So I like to grow plants. I'm a botanist. So I'll be like, well, how do I germinate this seed? I've never germinated this seed before. Let's set up, these experiments and do all these things. And I didn't learn how to do any of that except the actual experimental design in college. The rest of that was all just learning as I went. And I've talked about today a whole bunch of stuff. My degree is not in horticulture, but I've been able to do all of that by just kind of learning, following my passions, and following what makes sense to me and what's sustainable to me. And most importantly, well, not most importantly, but most importantly for me at least, you're going to doubt yourself. You have to work through it. That's where most people fail is at that step, because you start doubting yourself and it actually changes the way you behave. It changes the way that, if you think you're going to fail a test, you're probably going to fail that test, right? If you think you're going to ace the test, you might not ace it, but you're probably going to do well because you kind of have that mindset going in. If you go in thinking you're going to fail, you're going to fail. So that's why you have to get over it. You have to figure out how to work your way through it. And some people can, some people can't, but I highly encourage you try. And you never know where you are going to go. You never know where it's going to take you. I would have never thought that I'd be in the UAE touring a garden with a princess, right? That's just wild. I would have never thought that I would be doing an orchid show or running a conservation business, whatever that is. I just made that term up. That doesn't actually exist. I made it up. So conservation business, I made it up. So that's how Wild Toledo grew. And that's how everything worked out. So you're going to doubt yourself. It's okay. Just get over it and work through it. And that's easier said than done. And I promise you, you'll be better for it and a better human being and have a better career. So with that, thank you.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, is there anybody that would like to ask Dr. Walsh a question if you didn't get a chance to earlier today? If you get extra credit for a question, do you have one? Oh. Do you really have a question, Lena? I'm just teasing. Your favorite plant, favorite orchid?
My favorite orchid?
Mhm.
Oh, I don't know. Orchid's the largest plant family on earth. That's like asking, I'd have to say Cypripedium candidum would be my favorite plant. That's what I did my research on.
Question,
There
and
you go.
we're gonna have to spell it correctly.
Oh,
Any other questions? Oh my gosh. Okay. Okay, you can yell it. Weed control protocol.
good question. Yeah, so I totally glossed over that whole section because normally people aren't interested in that. So, so everybody's licensed applicators, and we actually have to go out. The first 2 years are the most critical. We have to go out and do hand removal. It's either hand removal or chemical removal, and it really just depends on what invasive species it is. So I don't know if you guys have Canada thistle down here. Probably not. Canada thistle is like the scourge of everything. They spread by rhizomes. They're terrible. So you obviously have to use something like 2,4-D glyphosate on that. And so we have no problem using chemicals or anything else like that. So it's a regular occurrence. Usually somebody goes out once a month and kills all of the invasive species. And the reason why that is because did you know that seeds can actually store in what's called the seed bank for 50 years? So urban soils are actually 50 years of invasive seeds loading up. And if you turn up the soil, most weed seeds, when they're exposed to light, they'll germinate. So when you turn up the soil, you actually expose the seeds to light and you would get even more invasive species. So by trying to, aerate and make the soil better, you actually just made it worse. So that's why we don't do that when we're doing installations, is to cut down on those weeds and leave them in the seed bank. But normally we use chemicals and we have a regular protocol, and depends on the species. Yep.
Anything else? Okay, let's thank Dr. Walsh one more time. And Miss Sharon Jackson has your sign-in sheets. If you're coming for a class or a professor, please make sure you sign before exiting the room.